Marieke is an associate professor at the University of Groningen, and she works in cognitive modelling amongst some of the other wonderfully interesting topics that I've mentioned as well. We're so happy that you took some time out of your visiting researcher period at the University of Copenhagen, where you're working on cognitive control, to come visit us here. And without further ado, the floor is yours, Marieke. Thank you again.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me, Christine, and nice to see everyone, like some familiar faces, some new faces. So yeah, compared to what I've talked about here before, I think I've talked once on the research with Tibetan monks and once on research with dancers, or maybe a combination of the two, I don't remember. Anyway, this is my more tame work, you could say, the more conventional kind of stuff. But I'm super interested in this thing that our mind does kind of all the time. It goes everywhere and with all kinds of fairly unexpected places, and there is nothing wrong with that. I mean, maybe some of the students were interested in mind wandering because they're like, oh, my mind just gets distracted all the time. What should I do about it? This is the reaction I most often get. And in general, I'd say also, chill, there's nothing wrong with mind wandering. In fact, it would be really bad if you wouldn't have any mind wandering, because it is what makes us human, what allows us to think and have ideas. But of course, sometimes it can be problematic, and I'm super curious about when is it helpful and when is it not. So that's what I've been exploring in the past couple of years, together with a wonderful team of PhD students, some of whom are now postdocs or other, and Stefan is now a lecturer, and Lionel works with a startup company, and Marlijn is also a postdoc, and actually Soon is the only one who's still a PhD student with me. But anyway, so today I'll first spend a little bit of time trying to talk about what is mind wandering, how do we measure it in the brain, then what do I think is the key to adaptiveness of mind wandering, then a little bit of this modeling bit that I also like to do, and yeah, that's basically the plan. So let's start with mind wandering. So fun fact, we mind wander about 50%, almost 50% of the time. At least this is a fairly reproducible finding in many studies, and so if you're me, you might be thinking about a rare, beautiful day in Groningen and do some ballet, which is what I like to do. So it's just like the blue sky is just as rare in Groningen as it is here, so you probably understand what I mean. And we also have canals, just like you have in, at least in Copenhagen. So the question is, how do we measure this kind of stuff? How do you get these kind of statistics? So actually the whole field of mind wandering is, you can boil down to one very simple thing. It's the measurements. What's new in this field is kind of the measurement method. So basically what you do to measure mind wandering in the lab is step one, you give someone a boring task. Now this is very easy because I'd say most psychology tasks are boring tasks, so you just start with that. And then you include in that task so-called thought probes. So thought probes are self-report questions that ask the person, what are you thinking about right now? And this is the innovation over previous research on the topic. So before the field of mind wandering came around, there was a very bad rap on introspection. Now, of course, lots of people here have probably much more nuanced thoughts about this, but one problem in a lot of earlier research on introspection was that people were asked questions like, how often do you think about X? And that is a really, really difficult question because it's very hard to remember what kind of stuff you're thinking about. Welcome. So now we, sorry,
I told you this was popular.
Yeah, that's great. Let's take a break for a moment to let everyone come in. Okay, so the way we measure mind wandering is A, give someone a boring task, and B, ask them, what are you thinking about right now? Every about 30 to 90 seconds. This turns out to be a sweet spot because if you ask people more often, then they never get a chance to even go mind wander. But if you ask them less often, and you do a task that's about an hour, then, you know, when you have an interval of about 30 to 90 seconds, you get about 60 samples per hour, which is reasonable. Not that great, but reasonable. reasonable for statistical analysis. If you get much less, then your statistics are going to be screwed, so that's not a great idea. And then you give them multiple choice questions. A typical starter question would be options like, I was thinking about the task, how I was doing on the task, external stimuli, internal stimuli. My mind was completely blank. That's also a very interesting response option. And then people just tick the box which one applies to them. And you can also ask follow-up questions like, were you thinking about the past, present, or future? So more asking about the content of the thoughts, or was it self-directed or other-directed? And you can also ask them a little bit about the phenomenology of the thoughts. Like, was it easy to disengage from, or quite difficult to disengage from? And I find this particular question really interesting, so we'll get into that later. But yeah, this just gives you the idea. And the reason for doing this is, of course, it really dumps down the experience that people have. But on the other hand, it has the advantage that you get quantitative data, so you can really do these kind of statistics, and B, it's also a little bit less private or personal. People will not feel so hesitant to give you this kind of information, especially if you introduce it well and say in the beginning, please try to be as honest as you can be, and we know that people for some proportion of the time are not thinking about the task, so that people feel comfortable at responding, giving honest responses, because obviously there's some it's somewhat socially undesirable to report that you're distracted, which I give you hereby full permission. I know that about 40% of the time your mind will be somewhere else, and this is okay. This is important for our human or being human. Okay, the computer also likes to go somewhere else for a part of the time. Anyway, so that's the idea. And then you get certain, I have to click on this again. Yeah, there we go. Then you get certain kinds of data. You can do really fun stuff with this. So one thing, for example, you can do is you can take this response to the multiple choice question. If they say, I'm on task, then you can compute how well are they doing the task right before that question. If they say I was off task, like thinking about sensations in my body, then you take the behavior right before that question, and you compute, say, the average accuracy, and if you subtract the two, you get the difference in behavior between mind wandering and on task. And here, for two different kind of tasks, one is called a sustained attention to response task. This is a very popular one in mind wandering research. You get a significant drop in accuracy. I mean, it's not massive, like just an accuracy of 0.2 less accuracy, but still it's significant, and the same applies to a visual search task. In this SART task, just to give you an idea, what people have to do is something like you have a large number of stimuli where you just have to press the button, but then for a subset of these stimuli, you have to not press the button. So for example, you show them digits with equal probability, all possible digits, and whenever you see a digit, you respond, except when it's the number 3. So it's a super boring task, and very effective in eliciting mind wandering. And you also see very distinct patterns in response time. So here you can see that actually in the SART task, people speed up and become almost 20 milliseconds faster. And this is because, with this kind of button pressing task, you will just start to go into automatic mode and just start rhythmic tapping almost. In a visual search task, actually people become slower and more variable. So in a visual search task, we'll see it in one of the next few slides, but basically they get a display of different shapes, and they have to say, does it contain a particular shape of interest, like a blue circle or a green triangle or something. So that is basically generally how we measure mind wandering. And then of course we can also look at how, with these kind of paradigms, what it looks like in the brain. And so my favorite brain measurement is EEG, because it's kind of easy, low cost, and we have a nice EEG lab in the office where I work. And it also has a very high temporal resolution, which is nice. So you have people do this boring task, and then you put some electrodes on their heads, and then you can compare the EEG between mind wandering and on-task episodes as classified by these questions, right? These questions are like, what are you thinking about right now? The task, my performance on the task, external stimuli, internal stimuli, and so on. And so this is literally what this looks like. So this is the example of the start task, and this is the example of the visual search task. In this case, actually, our version of the start task, the sustained attention to response task, was a bit different. So here we give people words, and whenever it's a lowercase word, which is about 90% of the time, they press a button. And whenever it's an uppercase word, they do not press a button. So it's the same idea as with the digits. Most of the time you press a button, sometimes you don't press the button, and then sometimes there's this probe question. What are you thinking about right now? And then if they say, I was thinking about the task or my performance on the task, then okay, this is on task. And if they say I was thinking about external sensations or other stuff, then okay, this is mind wandering. And then we also record EEG signals. So you have these EEG signals, and you can also classify them in the same way, right? So if people say, I was thinking about the task, then this gets all, the EEG signal at this time gets labeled as on task, and otherwise they get labeled as mind wandering. And so you can do the same thing with the visual search. So this is the example of the visual search task. So in this case, the target is a blue circle. And so every few seconds, they get a display of blue shapes. And their question is there a blue circle in this? If so, they press one button. If not, they press another button. In this case, there is a blue circle. In this case, there's no blue circle, and so on and so forth. And again, every so often, they respond to this question, what are you thinking about just now? So that's the task. The behavior, in fact, we've already seen that was the behavior that I just showed, where there is a reduction in accuracy when people report their mind wandering, and also there is a change in response time, either speeding up or slowing down when they report being mind wandering. So now we're going to do our EEG analysis. And the way we do this is more of the AI way. So I work in the AI department, and what we like to do is to use machine learning classifiers to measure brain activity. So the fun thing is with these things, you can give them many examples of your particular classes of interest, like in this case, mind wandering and being on task. And then it learns like what difference is there between brain activity that distinguishes these two classes. And then you can eventually make predictions about single trials about whether the person is paying attention to the task or whether they're mind wandering. And so in this case, for those of you who know something about machine learning, if you don't know worries, you can understand it just as well with machine learning, but for those who want to know, we used a support vector machine with a radial basis function, which turned out to be quite good at, well, the best of all the things we tried, not that good, but we will get to that, to find the examples that best distinguish. So actually, don't worry, as I will show you, we're very bad at predicting whether somebody's mind wandering, so there's no danger of, developing systems that are going to predict whether you're mind wandering or not based on your brain waves, because it's way too bad for that. Also, by now, it's prohibited by European law. I was just reading in the newspaper this morning, so that's a good thing, I think. But for this research, we are just, seeing how well it does. And this is the accuracy. So what we're seeing here is how well this classifier can predict whether somebody is mind wandering or on task. And every set of bars belongs to one participant in our study. So in this study, we had 17 participants with good enough data to look at. At chance level, of course, the classifier would get 50% correct. It would just randomly guessing. Here we can see that, for some participants, it's basically almost at chance level. But for some participants, it gets quite a bit better. But there's one more interesting bit that has to do with the colors here. Because we were curious about whether whatever was distinguishing in the brain between mind wandering and on task, whether that would be very specific to the task we're using, this task where you just had to decide whether a word was upper or lowercase, or whether the task where you had to search for the particular shape. So what we did was we made some classifiers that were trained on one task, like this SAR task, and also tested on the same task, and also for the visual search. So the orange is trained and tested on SART, and the green is trained and tested on visual search. So you can see there's some reasonable accuracy, and actually sometimes it gets pretty good. like almost sometimes 90% or so. But then, if you compare that to the situation where we train the classifier to learn this mapping between on and off task on the start task, and we test it on this very different task, it actually does pretty well as well. So you can see that in many cases for the purple and blue, which are this train on one task, learn on the other task, it actually does almost just as well on the average. So whatever we have, you know, developed here is a fairly task general classifier. So that is encouraging. The next question for neuroscientists is, of course, I mean, if you talk to computer scientists, they're probably going to be like, oh, that's terrible accuracy, we're not interested. But for neuroscientists, it's like, okay, not amazing accuracy, but actually reasonable. If I get 90% on neural data, I almost start to worry, because behavioral human data is just not that clean. So this is reasonable. So the interesting question though is, what part of the brain activity is it actually using? So Christina, the PhD student who did this work, what she did is she made now separate classifiers on different parts of the data. And one thing I should also say is she did, I think, a very smart thing in this study, which is not just throwing all the data in there in the classifier to try to learn the patterns, because there is a lot of noise in our brain data. So instead, what she did was she first looked in the literature of what do we know about the brain signals that distinguish mind wandering. And then she found things like there's an event-related potential called the P1 and an N1 and the P3. So these are, you know, whenever you brain sees, whenever I flash a stimulus at you, your brain does a little blip, 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 you know, going up and down. And then the first peak is called the positive P1 and then the negative N1 and so on and so forth. So these things, we cleaned them up a little bit with a technique called single trial ERPs. We did also looked at alpha oscillation. So alpha waves between about 9 and 14 hertz, they're about the most stable human brain signal that we have, and also generally associated with idling, and you get it very strongly when a person just closes their eyes. So plausibly associated with mind wandering, because that might be one thing you start to do when you close your eyes. Also people who meditate know this kind of thing very well. And then theta waves are almost often anti-correlated with alpha, so they might also give us some information when you try to concentrate very hard on something. Very often, especially in the frontal part of your brain, your theta waves, they're 4 to 9 hertz, so a bit slower waves go up. And then also the synchrony between electrodes in these different brain waves. And so the relevant electrodes are color-coded here, and they correspond to the lines here in this figure. And then the synchrony between in these frequency bands is also color-coded with these lines. So here's like the synchrony between this more frontal electrode and this posterior electrode. That's this sort of beige color, and then you can see that over here. So stuff like that. So she made classifiers with each of these features separately to figure out, like, if we just take this feature, you know, how well can we predict? So in general, if we put all the data in there, we get about 65% accuracy, which is above chance level, but as I said, not that great. But now if we, for example, just take the alpha waves in this green electrode, so here in the back of the brain, then we already get maybe, I don't know, 64% accuracy. So actually this alpha wave is pretty helpful. And also this alpha wave here in the frontal part of the brain, and also the P3 in this PZ electrode. So these are the most informative parts of brain activity to tell us about whether somebody is mind wandering. So then we asked, well, you know, what is really driving this mind wandering? So there can be people put forward various explanations of, maybe you could say, confounding factors. So maybe all we're seeing here is just that the person gets drowsy at the end of the task, which if you've done any of those psychology tasks, it tends to happen. Or maybe what we're just seeing is a situation of very low task demands where, you know, this is where your mind tends to go wander. So we created a new experiment in which we manipulated these factors and then tried to separate them and see whether there was a separate brain signature for the mind wandering compared to a situation of low task demands and compared to a situation of low vigilance. So we created a situation of low versus high task demands by making an easier and a more difficult version of the task. And then we measured the vigilance, or we approximated it by just comparing the first half of the task to the last half of the task. And obviously in the second half of the task, you're going to be much less vigilant than in the first half of the task. And then we created classifiers that could predict low versus high task demands and low versus high vigilance. So we did the whole same logic. We created EEG samples from these different situations, and we trained classifiers. And here we see their accuracy. So this is the accuracy when we train and test the classifiers within the same individual. So what I just showed you. So there's one classifier for every person in our experiments. And again, we get maybe about 60-65% accurate for the task demands, for the vigilance, and for, again, the mind wandering. All of them are above chance, but not that much. And then we also, for this experiment, we were able to make a cross-participant classifier. So we put the data for all the participants together, and we trained it on, say, 19 of the 20 participants, and then we tested on the left-out participants. And actually, surprisingly enough, we almost did just as well. So actually, for this experiment, from this experiment on, we decided to go for this more generalizable across participant classifiers. Now, the interesting bit is, what if we take a classifier that's been trained to distinguish low versus high task demands and try to predict mind-wandering judgments? Because if mind-wandering is kind of overlapping with just distinguishing low versus high task demands, then we should be able to predict mind-wandering from a classifier that knows how to distinguish low versus high task demands. And similarly, if mind-wandering is kind of overlapping with just detecting low vigilance, then we should be able to predict mind-wandering from the vigilance classifier. Now, it turned out this was not at all the case. So if we have the task demands or the vigilance classifier try to predict mind wandering, they're solidly a chance level. So that's what we see here, both for the visual search and for the SART task. So it doesn't matter. Whereas, again, the mind wandering classifier is a bit better. So that was our next experiment. But we were still a little bit frustrated in, this was pretty poor performance if you want to predict whether somebody is mind wandering. And the reason is not that I want to build kind of detectors that sit there and detect whether somebody in my classroom is mind wandering. I think that would be a very unethical application. But I would love to know, for example, can we track for how long is somebody mind wandering? And if we put them in a slightly different situation, how does this dynamic between mind wandering and being more focused on the task, how does that change? So at that time, everybody who heard AI thought deep learning. So we did deep learning, which is a more powerful machine learning technique because it can learn lots of nonlinear transformations. And we made 3 different classifiers based on the state of the art in EEG prediction. And these were our results for the different classifiers, so we're not going to worry about the details. There's just slight details differences in the 3 architectures, but it doesn't matter. What matters is how well did we do. And here we have to focus on the orange lines, because the blue line is just to see, or the blue bar is just to show you did the training accuracy. So did the classifier learn to predict the training data? And obviously, hopefully it did most of the time. But you have to focus on how well does it do on predicting new data. And there you can see that now our highest accuracy is about 72%. So it's a little bit better than 65%, so yay. But there's more interesting stuff to learn from here. So one thing we should note is that this 72% we get from training on one experiment and then taking this trained classification machine and predicting data from a new experiment from different participants in a slightly different EEG system. So it also allowed us, we could train on data were collected with a 128 channel system and then predicting data from a 32 channel system. So it was really quite different. So these deep learning algorithms really are able to generalize a lot more. And also, where before the alpha oscillations and the P3 single trial ERP were doing the best at predicting, here we actually find that just feeding it the raw EEG time series was doing best at predicting. So these deep architectures are really best at figuring out what part of the signal is helpful for learning. Okay, so yeah, the deep learning does not help too much, but it does better at generalizing things. So then we finally get to the key question that I, put in my title of when is mind wandering adaptive and when is it not? So as I said, mind wandering makes task performance in general decline, at least on the kind of stupid tasks that we use most often in our psychology experiments. Sorry, I hope I'm not offending anyone here. Because there's also some tasks in which giving people space to mind wander, they actually also get better. There's some work from Ben Baird and colleagues that show that if you give people empty space in the task, they can come up with more creative solutions. And also we've done some work showing that people can use this empty space in tasks, so to speak, to plan already for an upcoming other task that they know is coming up. So you can also really do useful stuff which are mind wandering, and I'd say that that's why, we humans, our minds does love to wander and think about other stuff than maybe our most important task at hand. Although, of course, philosophically speaking, you can also question this whole notion of a task because it's a very awkward psychological construct, and in most real-life situations, it's not even that clear what is your task at any particular moment. So we can go into discussions about that later if you want to. Anyway, but for now, staying within the psychology framework, when is it that mind wandering does become problematic? So that's when I started to really think about this idea of sticky thoughts. This also comes from my So sticky thoughts, I sort of define here as thoughts that are difficult to disengage from. And this didn't only just arise quite randomly, but also from my frustration with doing some research on meditation, which in the early 2000s really started out as being framed as a kind of concentration optimization technique, and all the studies were really trying to show that attention got better in one or the other way from mind-wandering research. And I was like, just looking at my own experience and the people around me that meditated, I didn't feel like they got that much better in concentrating, but there was something else that I felt was changing, and that was just your attitude towards your thoughts. And it was very difficult to think about research that could connect to, and then I felt like, well, actually probably where it gets most closely connected to more mainstream psychology, neuroscience, is the inverse. So you have, hopefully in meditation, maybe you create more non-sticky thoughts that you allow them to rise and disappear as they go. But where they get really sticky is, for example, in depression, where you can have these thoughts that are constantly like questioning, what is my self-worth, why should I be doing this, and sort of not allowing you to concentrate on anything. I also have the experience of talking to PhD students that tell me when they are suffering from depression, they have the working memory of a goldfish, or it's really very difficult to concentrate. So I felt like, oh, this is something here that makes sense. So how can we measure this stickiness and take it into the lab using this technology that I was just talking about? Well, so we have the technology of the thought probe, so we can ask whatever questions we like, and this is when I came up with this question of how difficult is it to disengage from the thought. And first, we of course had to establish, like, can people meaningfully answer this question? If you just take, a random person from the street and put them in the lab, well, I mean, mostly university students put them in the lab. Turns out that this works actually pretty well. So for example, these are data from an eye tracking study where we recorded people's pupil size as it did the task. And normally whenever you show a stimulus at a person, your pupil does a little bit of, it goes opens a little bit and then closes again. This is called the pupillary response. We know from mind-wandering research that when you're mind-wandering, your pupil actually does not respond that much to an incoming stimulus. Interestingly, whenever you're thinking sticky thoughts, your pupil response also gets damped down. It's like your pupil sort of responds less to the incoming stimulation and is more in its internal world. And also, we can see that stickiness is associated with worse task performance. So this is a graph of the variability of response time measured as the coefficient of variation. And here's the level of stickiness, and you can see that for very sticky thoughts, people start to respond more erratically to the task, whereas for very non-sticky thoughts, their responses are much less variable. Also, we found in a different experiment, in fact an experiment that I will get to in one of the next few slides, that in a more complex working memory task where people have to manipulate information, that also more sticky thoughts were associated with decreased ability to do this task. And this is actually really a key task because this kind of complex working memory is associated with things like intelligence, so it's a super important sort of human ability. So this is in fact set task. It has a couple more features that made it really interesting, that's why we developed it. So in general, complex working memory is the ability that we, I think, all have, otherwise we wouldn't be in this room, to manipulate different kinds of information. And so normally it's measured by interspersing a task in which you have to remember something with another task that sort of distracts you from remembering that information. And we try to see like how many of these things can you still remember when we distract you with other stuff. So in this case, we did a spatial version, which is very nice because you can then also see like where are people looking in the grid? Are they actually looking at the thing we want them to remember, or are they looking at other stuff? So they have to remember the location of an X, and then we repeat this a couple of times. Like if we have it's called a span of 3, then we have 3 locations of X's you have to remember in order. But between the presentation of each of these X's, we distract you with another task with words that move around in the same grid. So very nice distraction. It's a pretty frustrating task. And these words are words you have to respond to. And in the neutral condition, they are objects, and you just have to decide whether they fit in a shoebox. So we show you apple, and then you say yes, and then we show you truck, and you say no. And you know, once you respond, it turns into a different word, and it keeps going for about 4 seconds, and then you get another X and another words. And then there is a blank for 2 seconds, and then you can recall the location of the X's in any order. And then about half of the time, we ask you, what were you thinking about when you saw this blank screen? Because at the blank screen, we don't have any particular task, right? So you could be rehearsing the location of the X's, that would be very much on task. But you could also be thinking about these words still, or you could be thinking about other stuff. Oh. Looks like we have a little break. Okay, there we go. We're back. So yeah. And people can do this task. I mean, it takes a little practice, but they can do this task and they can remember stuff. But we have one more interesting bit here, which is that we were kind of curious, could we get people a bit in this ruminative thinking? And the trick we used here is that in the other condition, we called it the self condition, we gave them decisions about personality words. So you saw kind, and you had to say, does that apply to me? Am I kind? And then we showed them maybe jealous or angry. And so they made these self-related judgments. And what we found, I'll show you in one of the next slides, is that when people make self-related judgments, they can remember fewer X's. And most likely this is because you start probably thinking a bit more about stuff like if somebody asks you, are you kind? Then maybe you start thinking about this fight you had with your partner this morning, and you know, and these thoughts tend to kind of linger. It's kind of amazing how thinking about yourself is kind of a magnet for all kinds of thoughts. Anyway, so there's lots of interesting stuff, and we're still, you know, we're working with the SAS right now and comparing more or less depressed individuals, and still we're sorting through the data, but some fun findings. So maybe let's start with what do people report thinking? And here we have an interesting bit, which is that if we compare people that score higher on depression scales compared to people that score lower on depression scales. So we're not diagnosing anyone here. We just take a general student population and ask them to complete these depression and rumination questionnaires, and we divide them into the high depression and the low depression groups based on these questionnaires. But you see that the more depressed individuals, they report having significantly more sticky thoughts. And also that this is especially true in the self-referential processing condition. Then they have extra sticky thoughts compared to the control condition, whereas there's absolutely no difference in the people that report being less depressed. Now there's another bit, which is self-referential processing associated with worse memory? And the answer is yes. So this is earlier data from 2018, where we showed that both for when you have to remember 3 of these X's and when you have to remember 4 of these X's, you can see that people can do it. Actually, in those days, people could do it pretty well. In our recent experiments, people are a bit more low on being able to do this task, which is another discussion we can have about what happened. Because in both cases, they're like AI students from our department. Anyway, but the main pattern is pretty clear here, is that we see a reduction in performance in the self-referential processing in blue compared to the control condition, does it fit in a shoebox situation, in green. And so, yeah. And then actually we can also wonder, is it the case that maybe people who tend to be more depressed according to these questionnaires, does that maybe widen this gap? Or is there at least a relationship between the width of this gap and your tendency to report thinking about other stuff during the task? Well, in terms of the depression, that's comparing less depressed and more depressed on these sides, it's not really a significant difference. But we do see a solid relationship between the difference you show between these self and neutral conditions in your accuracy, and how often you report the difference between these two conditions and how much off-task thinking. So you could say the more off-task thinking, the more you also show this worsening in accuracy. And there's one other little bit that we seem to be finding, which is that, so I've talked about a variety of different attributes of thoughts, and we're still sorting out the exact relationship between all things, but in this experiment we asked people about the stickiness of their thoughts, but also about whether they're positive or negative, which seems quite relevant for depression, and also whether they were self-related and other-related. In this case, we are focusing more on the self-relatedness of things. And what you can find here is that for positive thoughts, there's not really much of a difference between the control and the self-referential processing condition. It doesn't really matter. But for the negative thoughts, there is a different, thinking about self-referential, or the self-referential processing condition is associated with worse accuracy than the control condition. So it matters for the effect of self-related and self-referential thinking. It really has to be sort of negative thoughts. That's when it screws you over, sort of, in being able to remember stuff. That would be the sort of maybe popular interpretation. And then we found this kind of a relationship between the valence of the thoughts and behavior, and the effect of behavior also in a very different situation. In this case, we were going back to a more simple task, this sustained attention to response task, where they had to decide whether words were upper or lowercase. But in this case, we were comparing healthy individuals with those in remission from depression. So they are not currently depressed, but what's interesting about these people is that they are very likely to get depressed again, because depression is a very recurrent disorder. So in this kind of study, we were very interested in what makes people so vulnerable to depression. What is different about the brains and minds of these people that might get depressed again? And so we had them do the same task, and we measured their thoughts. And here we were showing the performance on this go/no-go task, this the start task, where you had to just decide whether words were upper or lowercase, essentially. And then we classified their performance on the dimensions of both positive and negative, as well as sticky and non-sticky. So positive is associated with circles, and negative is associated with triangles. And then non-sticky is associated with red, and sticky is associated with blue. And so you can see that in the healthy individual, or non-depressed, never depressed individuals at least, we don't know whether they're healthy, you can see that overall positive thoughts are associated with higher accuracy than negative thoughts, and there is not that much of a difference in the the positive. So the positive are the circles. And there's not that much of a difference in terms of the stickiness, but you can see that for the remitted depressed individuals, they only had good performance for thoughts that were both positive and non-sticky, but once the thoughts either became sticky or negative, their performance decreased significantly. So there is something about this thoughts needing, so the thoughts being negative that really can have an effect on performance, and especially when they are both negative and sticky, or both negative and in self-referential conditions. That combination seems to make a difference. And it also can affect your decision making. So here we have another kind of modeling bit. So I don't know, are any of you familiar with drift diffusion modeling? Few. Okay, no worries. I'm not gonna go through mechanics of that model, but basically it's a very smart technique that you can use to extract from a pattern of accuracies and response times components of behavior, like your ability to extract information from making decisions, and separate that from speed-accuracy trade-off. And speed-accuracy trade-off is this thing that either you can go faster, but probably you're less accurate, or you can go slower and then you're more accurate. So those are two components that both influence the accuracies and response times, and normally they're confounded together, but this model sort of allows you to separate them. And so if we take only this component through this modeling approach of how well you make your decisions, we can also see again very interesting differences between the less depressed and the more depressed individuals. Namely, what you see is that the more depressed individuals in general were showing worse decision performance, which is interesting because there's a lot of subjective data on people saying they can make decisions less well, but very little objective data. And so these are some data that we show here. But more interestingly, we also show that part of this decision difficulty could be driven by these sticky thoughts, because if we compare the self-reported stickiness, more sticky are in blue and less sticky are in red, you can see that less sticky thoughts are associated with much better decision making than more sticky thoughts. And we also, just for completeness and transparency, also showed an effect on the non-decision time. So these are perceptual motor components on decision making, but I don't know how to interpret them, so I'm not gonna try to make up some stories that aren't reasonable. So anyway, but this is, I think, a very interesting finding. So then I've already alluded to this question of to possible responses on what makes thoughts sticky, right? And it seems like evaluating yourself has something to do with it. And so before maybe I do a little quick jump into the modeling, I just want to show you data from a very different kind of experiment that my PhD, a former PhD student, Lionel Nguyen, did. So this is a bit more of a social neuroscience experiment. It's a tacit coordination task, but it's connected to the previous by the fact that we also asked these questions about mind wandering in this experiment. And so what people had to do in this kind of situation is actually, it was not just one person, it was two people sitting together, like next to each other in a room with a wall between them. And they both saw a display of 4 stimuli, either 4 color stimuli or 4 shape stimuli. And they had to choose one of these 4, just press a button, but had to figure out how to choose the same one as their partner without talking. So this might seem like magic, but it's not, because basically they do this repeatedly. So after a little while, they start to come up with some kind of rules, like we always pick the one that's the most red, or the one that's the most, has the most corners, or something like that, from this kind of set of stimuli. So people are able to do this. So that was first experiment. But then in the second experiment, we wanted to see whether we could influence this through a mindfulness, loving kindness, and a control intervention, and also what people were thinking about in this experiment. So it turns out that the interventions didn't do anything, but also these interventions were like 10-minute induction, so probably it's just too weak to have an effect. But there is some very interesting data that I think I'm more proud of. So this is data from before the intervention for the groups. And what we see here is that their average performance, so how well they were able to choose the same stimulus as the other person, as a function of if either of them was engaged in self-focused thought versus whether both of them were engaged in other focused thoughts. So if both of them were not engaging in self-related thoughts, then their performance was significantly higher than when one of them was engaged in the self-focused thoughts. And the same was true after the intervention. It just got a little better, but it didn't matter which intervention we gave, including the control intervention of visualizing a parking lot. So yeah, the intervention didn't really matter, but it's still a very interesting finding, I think, about there's something very interesting about self-related thinking, and especially self-evaluation. So anyway, we can talk a bit more about that, but I'll just end with a tiny bit of modeling if you're interested. So how can we get a computer to mind wander? So yeah, I work in the AI department, and this is one of the things I do because also people don't realize that really a fundamental part of AI is modeling the human mind and trying to understand the human mind by creating computer models of it. So basically what you do is to make this happen is you make a model of the task, you make a model of mind wandering. In our case, we modeled this as just retrieving stuff from memory because it's reasonably close to what mind wandering feels like, at least in my case. And then we let these models interact and we see how well both the human and the computer do on the task. And we implemented in this cognitive architecture that's called ACT-R. It's basically like a toolbox of cognition, and you say, okay, we basically use these kind of cognitive resources like simulated eyes or simulated working memory to cobble together how the procedure by which we think the human solves this kind of a task. And we write kind of rules like this. If, you know, our goal is getting distracted, then what we're going to do is we're going to retrieve an item from our memory and stick this in our memory, and then that leads to a new state in which new rules can be executed and so on. And that allows us to predict responses and response times, and basically we can then predict accuracy, for example, on the task. And you can see here is data from Jérôme Sacour from the ENS in Paris. And you can see that the data and the simulation are reasonably close, the same for response time and the same for variability in response time. So, okay, we got the basics right. But most important thing, we got our computer to introspect, of course, with huge quotes. The data show that people are about 60% of the time on task. And also this is what our computer says. So basically when we have a simulated thought probe, basically what the model does is it checks whether it is focused on the task or whether it is focused on this memory retrieval process that is the mind wandering. And if it's doing this mind-wandering thing, then it can also report on whether it's a future or past or present related memory. But then the interesting bit is how can we create this model and try to turn this model into a model of depressive rumination. So rumination is a narrowly focused, uncontrolled, repetitive thinking that's mostly negative and self-referential. We already saw a lot of data on this. And it lies at the core of depression, which is why I think it's so important to understand it better. And so how do we model this? Well, I basically increased the number of negative memories, and also I made the connection between these memories more strong. And then what I showed is that, or really what Maarten van der Velde, the very smart master student who did this project, showed, is there was a decrease in simulated accuracy for the depressed model compared to the control model, and there was not much of a difference in the amount of on-task and variability. So yeah, these are just data purely based on the simulated data, just purely based on these assumptions, but it was really interesting to see how just assuming these very simple things about the model could really change the behavior significantly. And yeah, that was basically all. So I wanted to make sure that there's still at least a little bit of time for questions. So I'd say my main summaries are mind wandering occurs almost half of the time. We can track it most reliably in occipital alpha oscillations. It is self-evaluation that tends to make thoughts sticky. So that's why I put another ballet picture in there. This is from me, from ballet camp, where that's one of the situations where I think my thoughts tend to become less sticky when I'm completely focused on the situation around me. Like when you're in ballet camp in a performance, you don't know the piece very well and you have to really be together with each other and pay attention to what's going on. And that's one situation where I think self-evaluation tends to be less. Anyway, and then the modeling of mind wandering helps us to understand why sticky mind wandering is helpful. And also that these sticky negative memories might help us explain rumination. So that's basically it. Thank you.